Hello and welcome, everyone. I am Jessica Holting, the Assistant Manager of Education at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, Board of Directors, volunteers, and staff, I would like to thank you for being with us for this very special program, Ordinary Men with Christopher Browning. Over a decade ago, Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center was built from the ground up by local survivors. The museum is dedicated to preserving the legacy of the Holocaust by honoring the memories of those who were lost and by teaching the universal lessons that combat hatred, prejudice, and indifference. Ordinary Men is a true story of the Reserve Police Battalion 101 from the German Order Police, which was responsible for the mass killings and roundups of Jews for deportation to Nazi death camps in occupied Poland. This evening, we will hear from Christopher Browning, the shocking account of how a unit of average middle-aged Germans became cold-blooded murders of tens of thousands of Jews, and how themes of ordinary men continue to resonate today. Browning argues that most men of the Police Battalion 101 were not fanatical Nazis, but rather ordinary, middle-aged, working-class men. These men committed atrocities out of a mixture of motives, including group dynamics of conformity, deference to authority, role adaptation, and the altering of moral norms to justify their actions. Christopher R. Browning was the Frank Porter Graham Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill until his retirement in May 2014. Before taking up this position in the fall of 1999, he taught for 25 years at the Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. Browning received his bachelor's degree from Oberlin College in 1967 and his master's and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of 8 books, including Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and The Final Solution in Poland. Browning has served as the J.B. and Maurice Shapiro Senior Scholar and Ina Levine Senior Scholar at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. He has been a fellow of the Institutes for Advanced Studies in Princeton, New Jersey, and on the campus of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has also received Fulbright, Alexander von Humboldt, DAD, and Woodrow Wilson Foundation fellowships. He is a 3-time recipient of the Jewish National Book Award, Holocaust category, for Ordinary Men, The Origins of the Final Solution, and Remembering Survival. For his last book, he is also a recipient of the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. He was named a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2006. Browning has served as an expert witness in war crimes trials in Australia, Canada, and Great Britain. He has also served as an expert witness in 2 Holocaust denial cases, the second Zundel trial in Toronto in 1988, and in David Irving's libel suit against Deborah Lipstadt in London 2000. After the talk, we will have a time for a short Q&A. Please place your questions in the Q&A box. There are hundreds of people on this call all over the nation and globe tonight, so we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So now it is my honor to welcome Christopher Browning.
Thank you very much. The talk I want to give tonight really has sort of 3 parts. The first, we'll discuss the origins of the book Ordinary Men, how I came about writing it as I did. The second will be the initial critiques of the book that occurred in the 1990s. And then finally, some considerations of what's taken place in the field of what we now call perpetrator research or perpetrator studies after 2000. The origins of the book really began with a research trip I took to Germany in 1987. I was looking working at the Central Agency for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes, which was the central clearinghouse for investigating ongoing cases. And they had a complete collection of all the previous indictments and judgments of trials that had taken place up to that point that they had been instrumental in bringing about. And I was above all trying to look at every past judgment or indictment of a trial in Germany having to do with Nazi crimes in Poland. Because at that point, Poland was, of course, the home of half the victims of the Holocaust, but nothing like half the documents told us about Poland. So in a sense, Poland was under-researched and under-documented given its weight, its importance historically as the epicenter of the Holocaust. And that is when I came across an indictment, a Reserve Police Battalion 101. And reading the indictment was a stunning experience. Two things immediately just leapt off the pages of the indictment. The first was the testimony of one of the policemen telling about the commander, Major Tropp's speech to the unit on the eve of its first killing action, where Tropp basically gave the men the option of not taking part, in which he invited the rank and file, in effect, that if they didn't feel up to killing innocent women and children that day, they could step out, turn in their rifles, and not take part. I'd never seen a public offer by a commander not to take part in a killing action before. And this was then, for me, one of those eureka moments in the archives when you come across an absolutely key event that has much wider significance. And the second thing that came evident in the testimony as I read the indictment was the very quality of the testimonies they were quoting. Had a quality that was simply different than I'd read before. In so many of the German court records, one just reads lie after lie, distortion after distortion, denial after denial. And here I was reading horrifically graphic descriptions of what the men had actually been doing instead of denying that they had been doing it. And that I had never seen such a concentration of graphic, clearly vivid descriptions of killing actions that I was reading in this indictment. So those two qualities, the issue of an incident that squarely framed the issue of choice, that a commander had given the men the choice of not participating if they did not want to, and the quality of the testimony, which was so blunt, so vivid, so graphic about what the men had done, that I resolved that I would have to go to Hamburg, where the trial had taken place, and look at the entire court record. Reading the indictment clearly would be just the opening, the beginning of it, and it clearly then led me on to going to Hamburg to read the entire record, which when I got there and got my court clearance at last was over 30 volumes of testimony given by 210 former members of the battalion. Up until that point, trials of killing units had been primarily of officers. You could find out the names of the officers, but if you didn't have a roster of the battalion or the killing unit, it was very difficult to find any rank and file that would come and testify. The officers were very well versed. They were coached ahead of time. They knew how to lie for one another. And the trials, both judicially and historically, were utterly frustrating to read the record of because they were basically well-coached denials geared at getting acquittal, not at finding historical truth, and certainly not at finding justice. But in this case, the roster had survived. And because the police unit, an order police unit, a reserve battalion, was like a National Guard unit in the United States, they came almost all from the same area. These men still all lived in Hamburg. 210 of them could still be located and questioned in the 1960s. And as rank and file, they were not particularly interested in covering for their officers. They were not part of that cohort of people dodging justice. And many of them, in fact, wanted to rat out their officers, and thus were willing to talk about what had actually happened in ways that I had not seen in the judicial record before. So the research experience there was extraordinary, reading through the testimonies of 210 men from a single unit. Historians almost never get that kind of density of testimony. 500 men, I had over 40%, in a sense, return of participation, of testimony by people who were participants and witnesses, which is extraordinary in terms of what kinds of materials historians can work with. Having read through the entire record and then tried to make sense out of it, basically, I came to conclude a number of key things that form, in a sense, the backbone of the book. The first, of course, is to return to that memorable opening speech that Major Trop gave, that other men confirmed the testimony I had read in the indictment. And this had not only been something available to the men on the first day, the first time that they had been asked to carry out a massacre, but this remained the standard operating procedure, the standard policy of the battalion for the rest of the time that they were in Poland. The officers knew it. They knew they could not force their men to shoot against their will. So this became an extraordinarily unique test case. Once you got beyond the standard alibis that perpetrators offered, namely duress. I was forced to. I had no choice. If I hadn't done what I was ordered to do, I would have been shot myself. Or putative duress. Well, even if I wouldn't have suffered dire circumstances, I didn't know that at the time. I had to assume that when my officers were screaming at me, that there would have been dire consequences. Here, both the two standard judicial alibis for people on trial in German Nazi crime trials were gone, duress and putative duress. And thus, the whole interrogations that were carried out thereafter had an utterly different quality because the men had to talk about reality rather than these false alibis that had become the standard for people who were on trial. So that was very, very crucial in terms of shaping what I was going to be looking at. In terms of who was in the battalion, it was also an important case study, not only because of the issue of choice was so radical, so front and center, but in terms of who was in the battalion, I would argue that if you were trying to collect a group of men who would have been the least likely group of men in Germany to commit mass murder on behalf of Hitler and the Nazis, it would have been a group of men like those in this battalion. It was not just a random cross-section of German society, but one, in fact, that should have worked against these people becoming Nazi killers. And let me try to explain that further. Age-wise, these were middle-aged men. By 1942, Germany, now as the war had gone on for 3 years, was conscripting men for wartime obligatory service, even if they weren't going to be going into the army. And so people of their late 30s and early 40s were now subject to conscription. But in this case in Hamburg, were sent to an order police battalion, not to the army. They were too old for the army, but still were going to have to do service in a unit that would be sent far behind the lines to do occupation duties as police that presumably was going to be less taxing and didn't require the same kinds of physical stamina and ability that the army required for frontline duty. So age-wise, this average age of the rank and file of the battalion was 39 and a half years old, which meant that they were too young to have served in World War I. So these were not men brutalized by trench warfare and the horrors of World War I, but they were too old to have been in the Nazi socialization for youth. That is, they did not go to school in the Nazi period. They did not join the Hitler Youth. These people's formative political period was the 1920s in Weimar democracy. They knew another political world. They knew a world that had different political standards. They did not grow up in the Nazi bubble. So they had memories and a formative period of life in which they could measure what was happening under the Nazis by some other outside standard from their own past experience. Socially, they were mostly unskilled working class. By 1942, the Germans are still exempting very highly skilled workers. People building submarines in Hamburg as skilled engineers weren't going to be sent to Poland. But if you were a dock worker, a warehouse worker, a truck driver, a restaurant waiter, a clerk behind the desk, a white collar secretary, these kinds of people were viewed now as not holding down essential jobs to the war economy. And so people in their late 30s and early 40s holding those kinds of jobs were now conscripted and in this case sent into Reserve Police Battalion 101. The German working class was the group that had been least supportive of, least susceptible to Nazi appeal. The Nazis had swallowed up virtually all of the middle class parties in the early 1930s and had allied with the old conservative elites in Germany. But it was the communist and the socialist parties alongside the Catholic Party, the Center Party, that had been the only political groups to remain intact and not simply be swallowed up by the Nazis in their rise to power in the early 1930s. And that Hamburg and people of this social background then presumably had been much more highly involved in and supportive of the working class parties, the communists and the socialists and the labor union movement, than they would have of the Nazis. So they would not have come out of, at least not, they would have come out proportionally less from a Nazi milieu than other groups in Germany. And Hamburg itself was a city on the coast, open to the world and trade, that was noted as a city that the Nazis had not done well in. The Nazi electoral success there was less than elsewhere. They sometimes derogatorily referred to Hamburg as Red Hamburg because of the strength of the socialist and communist parties and labor union there. So if you were trying to choose a group of men least likely to become Nazi killers, they would have been people whose formative age had been in the 20s under Weimar democracy, in their 40s now. They would have been from the working class, one that had been less drawn to Nazism than others. And they would have been from a city like Hamburg, which had not been a easy Nazi conquest or Nazi stronghold. And that, in that sense, was who were in the rank and file of the Nazis, of Reserve Police Battalion 101. I also, in looking at and recreating, in a sense, the chronology of the battalion and the change in the battalion over time, was convinced of the testimony and the graphic testimony given that the first executions the unit was involved in, particularly the opening massacre at Józefów on July 13th of 1942, that for the men in the unit that had not been prepared for this, didn't know this was coming, that this was very traumatic. This was shocking. And many of them were quite distraught, very upset. They didn't know how to make sense out of this. And as one of the men said to one of his non-commissioned officers, if I had to do that again, I think I would go crazy. And in fact, of course, in reality, they had to do it again and again and again. This was going to become one of their major tasks. But what was surprising to me, in a sense, in the end, was not how upset the men had been at the initial execution or the first one or two, but how quickly they became habituated to what they were doing, how quickly they became numb to what they were doing, how quickly killing became routine. What had, and the men's descriptions and memory of the first one or two massacres is quite vivid, quite detailed. And then it becomes a jumble. They're doing it so often, and it's become so unmemorable, in effect, that they really can't distinguish one massacre from another, one deportation action from another. Everything becomes a blur, and they become quite numb and quite almost indifferent to what they are doing. Over time, I concluded that the battalion had really broken into roughly three groups. That a significant minority in the battalion became what I called eager killers. These were men who learned to enjoy killing other human beings. They learned to enjoy what the battalion was doing, got high on it. They volunteered for killing actions. When they would come back from the killing actions, they would sit around and tell jokes about what they had done and eat with a good appetite, and had no psychological strains in terms of what they had done. A middle group, I think the largest group in the battalion, are what I called compliers or accommodators. People that always did what they were asked to do and what they were assigned to do, didn't volunteer for patrols to go look for opportunities to kill Jews, but certainly did not confront authority, did not take up the standing offer of the major to excuse themselves and not take part in killing actions, when in fact the battalion was mobilized for a large-scale action, and many of these men had to become involved even if they didn't volunteer for that particular action. And then there was another minority that I called the evaders, people that either on the first day or at some point thereafter took up the standing offer of the commander, Major Trapp, to excuse themselves from killing actions. That meant they excused themselves from the actual act of shooting other people, even though they continued to do all of the other supporting, enabling activities. They would still serve as cordons around the shooting sites. They would still round up Jews in towns and drive them to the train station to be put into boxcars that would be sent to Treblinka, which was only about 60 miles to the north, where the arrivees would be gassed immediately upon the trains reaching Treblinka. But that they would not undertake the actual action of putting a rifle to the head of a victim and pulling the trigger, and that they would excuse themselves from that. Of the many duties of the battalion, they would excuse themselves from the most direct participation in the killing action. For those that were compliers, insofar as they tried to explain themselves, they would generally say that they didn't want to be thought weak by their comrades. They didn't want to be looked upon, down upon as not doing their share, of not being tough enough to do their share of the dirty work of the battalion. To not have participated would have been a kind of asocial act against your comrades, leaving them to do the dirty work, shirking. And so even if they didn't want to do what they were doing, they overcame their scruples and worked hard to not be seen as a weakling or a shirker. As far as those that evaded, almost invariably, they would excuse themselves or ask to be excused from the killing by admitting that they were too weak. That is, they would take on the stigma of being too weak. And what they did not want to do, what they didn't do, was to either criticize the killing policies of the regime or criticize the behavior of their comrades, their fellow policemen who were doing the killing. So instead of saying, I don't want to do that because that's a terrible thing, that's an immoral thing, that's a horrific thing you were doing, and that the regime is a regime committing atrocities that I don't want any part of, they would say, I'm too weak to do that. And this, of course, had the insidious effect of legitimizing what the others were doing and accepting the labeling of what they were doing as a lesser thing, as something that good men, tough men could do, but weak men couldn't, and they would take on the onus of being weak and accept that stigma as the way of getting out of the shooting without, in a sense, breaking their bonds with their comrades, without either criticizing the regime or criticizing their comrades. So it had, as I say, this insidious effect of validating that which they were not doing that is validating what the battalion was doing, which was killing innocent human beings. Certainly for the people who did not take part in shooting, there was also, in a sense, a feeling that, or even those that did sometimes if they were assigned, but at other times were assigned to the cordons or to the ghetto roundups, the simple division of labor, of not being the trigger puller, of not being the shooter, psychologically for these men was seen as basically almost not participating. That is, they would talk of actions in which they had not been the shooters, in which they had been the collectors of people, the ones who had brought the victims to the shooting pits or had brought the victims to the train, as almost as if they'd almost been uninvolved, as if they almost had no responsibility for what was taking place. So it was a kind of lesson in how even the most primitive division of labor was used psychologically to rationalize one's lack of responsibility for the ultimate outcome of the actions, which of course was the mass killing of human beings. Those were sort of the key conclusions I came to, and after reading through all of the testimonies and trying to construct the chronology of what the battalion had done and how the men had changed over time, how they had been affected by what they were doing. But after that, I also felt the need, having completed, in a sense, the narrative part of the manuscript, to add something further. And the conclusion was written, in a sense, after all the rest of the manuscript had been finished. And I was looking for some more insight into making sense of what I had just written. And there I came to the conclusion that of the various, one, that I would need a multi-causal kind of analysis, a multi-causal kind of explanation, because there was no single monocausal explanation for explaining why the men did what they did. But this would be one that would have to focus not on individual psychological abnormality, which a lot of perpetrator studies up until then had done. That it would not focus on these men somehow being, say, psychologically abnormal, but look for those explanations that would help me understand why they had done in Poland as part of a group something they never would have done of their own volition as individuals in Hamburg. And that therefore crucial for this was a group dynamic. How had people's behavior been changed by virtue of the fact that they were members of a group? And what could help me understand the group dynamic of a killing unit composed of people that were not trained for this, not selected for this, but nonetheless, as a group became killers, when individually almost none of them would ever have even dreamed of harming a neighbor or of shooting down a Jew in the streets of Hamburg on their own. And for that reason, I was going to look not at abnormal psychology, but look at social psychology, to look at the study of how people's social behavior is altered by virtue of being part of a group. And there were sort of three things that I think stood out in that, in terms of the power of being a member of a group, or what factors have the power to change individuals' behavior by virtue of the fact of being in a close-knit group like a police unit in occupied territory. And here, the social psychological experiments on conformity, on deference to authority, and on role adaptation proved to be the most important for me. And that they showed, obviously, a lab experiment in which, if we go, say, to Stanley Milgram's experiments about deference to authority, where the subject is at a control panel and is asked by the experimental supervisor to inflict pain on a learner who has failed to give the right answers, and he proceeds to do it because the experimenter is telling him that the supervisor has all the responsibility. If he doesn't continue, this will ruin all the results, and science will be set back, and there'll be no progress in learning about how people learn, and loading on these kinds of obligations to get the people to comply. Uh, Obviously, that's a situation in a laboratory, and when you're out in the field and you're actually killing people and being splattered with real blood, these are not the same. But nonetheless, what these experiments did show was how powerful these factors are. Conformity, deference to authority, role adaptation do shape profoundly the way people react as parts of groups, and that they wouldn't cease to act in shaping human behavior, even if you've shifted from a sanitary lab situation to the horrors of a real killing field in Poland. Or at least that's what I argued, and I think I was right in doing so. I was looking then in the conclusion, I look at a number of factors, but clearly for me, at the heart of that were those factors that illuminated, shed light on issues of group dynamics, of group interaction, and how those would be different as part of a group than they would be on the part of individuals. So that, in a sense, was what lay behind the writing of the book. Once the book was published, it did then encounter mostly favorable reviews, but also some significant, important, and constructive criticisms. And I'd like to look at three of those that were sort of central to the debates of the 1990s around my book. And then in 1996, 4 years after Ordinary Men was published, Daniel Goldhagen published Hitler's Willing Executioners, and took a very opposite position, and a very critical one of mine. If one reads the text, I'm not mentioned, but if one reads his footnotes, it is very self-evident that he was taking a very clear aim at me and at the book Ordinary Men and its interpretation. So there was a series of debates, and there's three issues I think that deserve considerable attention. One was the criticism that was raised that Reserve Police Battalion 101 was not typical, so it doesn't tell us something important about understanding the Holocaust. As one author wrote in an article, he titled it, "Ordinary Men or Ideological Warriors." And that his argument was that most of the people in most killing units were not like the middle-aged Reserve Battalion 101, that they had been highly Nazified, highly indoctrinated, highly trained, given various tasks preparing them for killing that kind of barbarized them, brutalization as a preparation, so that my middle-aged, randomly selected people off the streets of Hamburg were not the typical killing unit, and not even the typical order police unit, and therefore my conclusions should not be read as explaining why most perpetrators did as they did. I would say that in that case, in some ways, that was a correct criticism, but one that one should not take much comfort from. And let me try to explain that. In 1992, when I published Ordinary Men, that was the first in-depth study of any police battalion. This was a whole crucial manpower component to the final solution that had not been written about until then. So we had nothing to compare it with. After Ordinary Men, a number of other battalions did get studied, and we now have empirical studies of a whole raft of battalions. And so we can make the comparisons that I could not make earlier. And what emerges is that there were roughly three different kinds of police battalions from the order police. The first two of those groups, indeed, were groups of men who were younger, either in their late 20s or early 30s, that they were much more Nazified in terms of the percentage of their members who were Nazi Party members. They received much more training, much more indoctrination, and they were sent out to stints in the occupied territories that, in a sense, gave them a chance to practice enforcing Nazi racial imperialism before they had to actually carry out large-scale massacres. So that they were conditioned for and prepared for this, and were chosen from men who were much younger and much more Nazified in what they did. That Reserve Police Battalion 101, as I say, is a product of the mid-war, when manpower is very scarce and the Germans are at the bottom of the manpower pool. They're drafting the dregs. And so the reserve battalions created and sent out in 1942 are people who are taken off the streets of middle age. They don't have time to give them training and indoctrination. There certainly is no careful selection. They are not more Nazified than the population around them. And they're sent off with no prior preparation or even a clue of what they're going to do. So in that first massacre, for instance, there is no prior brutalization that had toughened them up for this kind of task. So the criticism this was not a typical battalion is right. It is a representative of less than a third of the battalions that were in the German, order police. However, and this is the key, it is their very atypicality that I think is going to cause us a great deal of discomfort. Because if we look at, and now we can do this, we can look at the body counts of every order police battalion that was involved in killing Jews. And if you line them all up and rank them, out of the more than 100 police battalions, Reserve Police Battalion 101, even though it was into the field a year later than most of its competition, because most of these were involved in Russia in 1941. 101 is not sent out to Poland until June of 42, doesn't begin killing till July of 42. Even though most of the other units had a year head start, and were composed of, as we've said, men who were more Nazified, more carefully selected, more indoctrinated. Of the some 100 plus reserve police battalions in the German occupation, in body count, Reserve Police Battalion 101 is number 4. There's only 3 more lethal police battalions in the entire German Third Reich. So that even without special selection, even without being more Nazified, even without being indoctrinated, even without prior brutalization, it turns out you can collect ordinary men off the street and turn them into one of the most lethal killing units in the Third Reich. So my view of that criticism is that it helped us, focus, but the conclusion that ordinary men can be turned into killers is in no way set into question. And in fact, it helps to highlight that these perfectly ordinary men were among the most lethal killing units of the order police and throughout the Third Reich, and exceeded in their lethality many units that were far more Nazified, far more indoctrinated, far more carefully selected, of far more younger men from more Nazi cohorts than they were. A second criticism was that I had ignored the ideological dimension, and particularly anti-Semitism within that. And I think that criticism was made in part because my book was always then paired with Goldhagen's, and his explanation is almost entirely an ideological cultural explanation. And in fact, he says that is, and German anti-Semitism is the sole sufficient explanation for why the men behaved as they did. And so mine was then categorized as the institutional, organizational explanation, the opposite of a cultural ideological explanation. Even though I don't think I excluded ideology and anti-Semitism, I didn't put it out front in the same way. So in a sense, by virtue of being paired, the book was, I think, a bit mischaracterized. But in any case, I did emphasize situational factors. And so often the books were said, well, this is the situational explanation, Browning's, and this is the ideological explanation, Goldhagen's. And that since Goldhagen emphasized anti-Semitism, I was characterized as the opposite of ignoring anti-Semitism. I think what one of the contributions made to those debates by a social psychologist named Leonard Newman was very crucial, because what Leonard Newman suggested was this whole notion of a ideological cultural explanation or a situational organizational explanation is a false dichotomy. Because in fact, there's no such thing as a kind of culture-free situation. People may be put into the same situation, but they don't interpret that situation. They don't understand that situation. They don't create that situation in their own mind, apart from the cultural and ideological assumptions that they carry with them. So that basically a way in which a German sent to Poland as an occupying force is going to interpret his position in Poland in line with German prejudice about Poles, German prejudice about Jews, German hyper-evaluation of the importance of duty to the military, and be affected by the fact they put on uniforms. These are maybe conscripts and reservists, but they now have a uniform and a status that gives them in Germany. And all of these are cultural factors that will shape how they interpret the situation they find themselves in Poland. So that in fact, situation and culture ideology on the one hand, situation on the other, are inextricably intertwined. They cannot be separated. We may see how they interact with one another different, and that's what really historians are trying to sort out. But I would now say one of the things that came out of this debate was our realization that there is no such thing as a non-cultural, non-ideological explanation, that it is inextricably intertwined with ideology and culture. The real issue then also is, what do we understand by German culture? Is it simply understood as anti-Semitism, or does it have to be understood as something much broader, much wider, much more multifaceted? And that's one of the things I'll come to at the end of the lecture in terms of how recent research has moved the goalpost, has helped us move forward. The third criticism that was made had to do with the issue of interpreting the testimony. Now, clearly, judicial interrogations, first of all, I'd say any account by someone given of an event 20 years after the fact is going to have all the problems that we face with human memory, that it's frail, that we reinterpret our past, we reinvent our past, we reshape who we think we are depending upon what's happened since then. A testimony in the 1960s is not the same as what actually happened in the 1940s. When you add to that judicial factor, these men don't want to go to jail, that they're not going to tell everything because they don't want to admit to things that they've done. The issue of how an historian uses judicial interrogations given 20 years later is very problematic. And I think everybody using this material recognizes that. But certainly Daniel Goldhagen accused me of basically being duped by my sources, that I wasn't nearly sufficiently critical enough of the testimony, that I believed much too much of what the men said, and that therefore my conclusions were invalid. My reply to that would be basically the following. I think one could look at this testimony and see that there are kind of three bands of it. Some of the testimony is so obviously false, so obviously a whitewash, so obviously denial that neither Goldhagen and I would use it. I mean, it's so filled with obvious lies and mendaciousness, we would dismiss it. Some of the testimony was so self-incriminating, so horrific, in which the men admitted what they had done and taken part in, that nobody's going to make that up, and that one can trust that testimony. And Goldhagen, in a sense, said, yes, that's the testimony he will use. as he put it, he will use the testimony that does not have even any potential for self-exculpation. Only that testimony that is so self-incriminating that, that there can be no doubt about it would be used. But there's a third band of testimony in the middle, in which the men are telling some of the truth some of the time, but not all of the truth all of the time. And in particular, they are telling the truth about what the battalion is doing, even if they're not telling the truth about what they themselves as individuals were doing. So they're admitting, they're hiding their individual guilt, but not hiding the guilt of the unit. And for the historian, that's a very important source. They're telling us all sorts of things that I think were very useful. So I said, I have to use that. And I have to use it carefully, but to not use it would be basically then to use only such a narrow band of testimony that you mistake the part for the whole. And Goldhagen basically argued all of these men are eager killers. All of them are anti-Semitic Nazi fanatics killing eagerly. But if all you use is a testimony of eager killers and exclude everything else, then you can come to no other conclusion than to confirm the hypothesis that you started with. And because you've only used evidence that can do no other than confirm that hypothesis. And that simply is not valid social science. So I argued that one had to use problematic evidence, use it carefully. And the question then is, was I careful enough? Were, for instance, some of my assertions about the battalion changing over time, starting out initially very upset, but then becoming very hardened and numb? Or in my assertion, the battalion divided into 3 groups, was that valid? And of course, those things can be tested by finding other sources that were not based on on the policeman's testimony. You can find other evidence that will shed light on that issue. So let me just look at one issue very quickly. And that is, did the battalion divide into roughly 3 groups that I'd called the eager killers, the accommodators, or the compliers, and the invaders? Well, we do have some interesting testimony from a man named Oswald Rufeisen. Oswald Rufeisen was a Jew from the German-Polish border region of Silesia, and people living there spoke fluent German and fluent Polish. So unlike Jews further east who spoke Yiddish at home, and as soon as they opened their mouth trying to speak Polish, any Pole could detect immediately that they were Jewish, Jews from Silesia could speak fluent, accent-free Polish and German. Rufeisen fled Silesia when the Germans came in 1939 to Lithuania. When the Germans invaded Lithuania in 1941, he fled south into what is now Belarus. He was 17-year-old at the time, a teenager. He was then picked up by the police captain in the Belarusian town of Mir, intercepted. The police captain demanded to see his papers, and Rufeisen said, "I've lost my papers, they were stolen." So Rufeisen said, or the police captain said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And he explained that he had fled Silesia, but claimed to be the product of a mixed marriage. Had a Polish parent and a German parent, and because he could speak Polish and German fluently, this seemed quite plausible. And so the police captain said, "Well, I'm going to need a translator because the Germans are coming to set up a police station here. So come home and stay with me and be my translator." 2 or 3 weeks later, the Germans show up, 13 policemen, reserve policemen from North Germany, on exact parallel to, identical sort of profile of the men in 101. And the commander of that unit, Sergeant Hein, of course, meets with the Belarusian police captain. Rufeisen serves as the translator. And the German Sergeant Hein says, "You're going to come and be my translator." So Rufeisen by night sleeps in the house of the Belarusian police commander, and by day sits at the right hand of Sergeant Hein, takes his meals in the German police station, and conducts all the business that Hein needs to with people in the local community, serving as translator. In the end, Rufeisen was denounced and he escaped. In fact, Hein let him escape. survived the war. And after the war, then, of course, could tell us about the internal dynamics of this middle-aged North German police unit of reserve policemen, not as an endangered, person trying to lie to hide his own crime, but as a Jewish survivor. So he had no reason to lie. And what does Rufeisen say about the dynamics of this police unit in town of Mir of North German policemen? First of all, he said they divided into three groups. And 4 of these 13 policemen were horrific people who went out and killed for fun of it, enjoyed what they were doing, and tried to increase their body counts whenever they could. That there was a middle group of what he called the ones who were the passive executioners of orders, that when they went on partisan actions and could operate as honorable soldiers, they came back exhilarated. When they went on Jewish actions, they came out depressed and acted as if they had been forced to do something dirty. That was his own word for this. And then there were 4 people who wouldn't go on Jewish actions, that wouldn't take part and assumed they had the right not to. And as Rufeisen said, nobody forced them to engage in those. So they had the exact 3-part division that I had deduced from the testimony. So it would seem, I would argue, that I was not so foolish or so gullible or so duped in terms of the conclusions I drew that Goldhagen accused me of. Where do we go from here? What happened after the 90s? Basically, that the Goldhagen-Browning debate, in a sense, had run its course. But in terms of where things went after there, I would say the most important thing was that issue I had raised just a bit earlier, and that is to try to understand a broader sense of German culture and to get away from our sole focus on anti-Semitism as an ideological explanation. I argue now that basically culture, ideology, situation, and organizational factors are inextricably combined. You can't have an explanation that doesn't include all of them. But I would also argue, and here's where I think the work of historians like Thomas Kuhne at Clark University have been so important, that we've widened the scope and said what beyond anti-Semitism was also crucial in the ability of the Germans to mobilize and harness people to commit crimes on this scale. And I think Kuhne makes 2 key arguments. One is that the Germans had certain Nazis, in a sense, appropriated several key elements of German culture, words that had real resonance, that they could appropriate and use to their own purposes, particularly in organizing men in groups. And these were the Volksgemeinschaft, the racial community, and comradeship. And that these 2 concepts, the comradeship, of course, feeds into the importance of conformity, of supporting the group, of not being the outcast, and so forth. And the racial community was important in that it set up what Helen Fine has said in an earlier book on genocide. Crucial for this is that if you can expel somebody from the community of human obligation, they are vulnerable. And the Germans, in taking a term, the people's community, Volksgemeinschaft, and turning that into the racial community, had basically taken what was a very inclusive term and turned it into a very exclusive term, because, of course, excluded now from the Nazi version of the people's community were gypsies and Jews and the handicapped and anybody else that they wanted to keep out. And what this enabled them to do, in effect, was then to put those people outside what became an increasingly exclusive notion of morality. That is, the moral revolution of the Nazis had, in effect, one aspect was that it was to apply only to Germans. You had no moral obligation beyond the German community. People outside that were not included. And to, in a sense, turn morality on its head. And let me give one example so we can close up here very quickly of an inversion of morality. And this is an example from Serbia that doesn't involve Jews. This is the German armies carrying out reprisals, mass reprisals against Serbian civilians in punishment for the Tito uprising, the communist uprising. And the order that the general gives out was that you must punish the whole population. There's no such thing as non-combatant immunity. And that this meant for every German killed, you were going to shoot 100 Serbs. And this is what they proceeded to do. And then he went on to say, anybody who has humanitarian scruples about this and doesn't want to do it, sins against their comrades. So this is it. If you kill unarmed civilians, men, women, children, you are being moral. But if you don't, you are sinning against your comrades. The sin is not to commit immorality on behalf of your comrade. It's to have any kind of moral scruples for people who are outside your moral world. And so I think it's that ability for us to look much more broadly. Anti-Semitism is obviously key because they're one of the groups outside the Nazi moral universe. But this whole phenomenon of inverting morality and excluding people from moral obligation was a much broader phenomenon in Nazi Germany, and explains, of course, why the same people who killed Jews could kill handicapped people, could kill Soviet prisoners of war, could kill civilians. There's a whole raft of enemies lists outside the Nazi community of human obligation who are at peril in the Nazi world. I will stop at that, and I guess we'll leave it up to Jessica to take over again.
Thank you so much, Professor Browning. We have so many questions, and a lot came in. We're going to start off with talking about the evaders. A lot of people want to know when they evaded, did anything happen to them? What was the percentage of people that evaded the orders?
Nothing happens to them. And in terms of percentages, I had estimated that it was between 10 and 20%. Okay. Subsequent research I have done where I found actual cases where you can count, it's higher than that. It's between 10 and 20 and 30%. So we don't know what the percentage is. We do know that there was a significant minority, and whether it's 20% or a little above or a little below, we can't say. But we do know it was significant. It is not just a handful of people. We do know as long as they basically followed the line that I'm too weak, I can't do that, nothing happened. The line that people couldn't cross is if they not only didn't take part, but they tried to persuade other people in the unit not to take part as well. If they would take the moral stance and say, this is wrong, the regime's policy is criminal, don't do that, then they are court-martialed. But they are not court-martialed for disobeying an order. They are court-martialed for subverting morale, for destroying the war capacity of the government. Certainly the SS did not, and the military did not want court-martials over somebody saying he's being court-martialed because he wouldn't shoot a defenseless woman or child. But they will court-martial you for subverting morale. So as long as you did it as an individual, there was no problem. If you tried to organize group resistance, group evasion, then you were in trouble.
Interesting, interesting. There's also questions about afterwards. How was there remorse after the war? Did you ever come across that in your testimonies?
No, I would say between the coming back from war and when this investigation opened in the early 60s, the men showed an astonishing capacity for repression. And in part because everybody around them in Nazi Germany wanted to repress and deny what they had done. So it's not like soldiers coming back from Vietnam being asked, how many babies did you kill? This is a whole society that embraces their amnesia, and everybody's agreed. There's a societal consensus that we all will pretend this never happened and we never did anything. Once the investigation begins, for some of the men, they now begin to have what we would now call post-traumatic stress syndrome. They complain, I'm having nightmares at night now that you're making me talk about this. Mm-hmm. And we had one suicide. But overwhelmingly, the tenor of the interviews is not remorse, but self-pity. It is my bad luck. In the 1940s, I got drafted into a unit that was sent to do these terrible things, and I had to do them. And 20 years later, they've changed the rules, and now being investigated because what I did then is now considered a crime. And I'm a second bad luck. Who could be more unlucky than me? The victims don't even enter the picture. There's almost no memory of the victims or consideration of the victim. It is all self-centered, and it is very much self-centered in terms of self-pity, their bad luck, the raw deal they got, not what happened to the victims.
Shocking, shocking. I also want to go to, how does your work now intersect with how Father Dubois and all of his work in the Ukraine and about the Einsatzgruppen? Have you worked together, or?
We haven't worked together. I've met him,
Yes.
but of course, mine in a sense was one of the first works on the killing fields beyond the gas chambers, where we were actually looking at what the dynamics of these massacres were. What for us, what we have is two very different source bases. I am looking at the testimonies of the perpetrators themselves, the policemen. He, as a Catholic priest, is going to the Catholic Ukraine and has a credibility to talk to villagers that an historian would not have, and they confess. It's a kind of confessional. They tell him things about what they witnessed. So he is getting the picture drawn out of the memories of the bystanders who witnessed this. And of course, some of them are much more than bystanders. They enriched themselves with the property of their neighbors. They betrayed their neighbors, informed on them. They may have been even in the auxiliary police and shot their neighbors. But he was able to get, and this was the really valuable thing about his contribution, get Ukrainians to talk when earlier they had engaged in sort of universal denial as well. And so he gets a source base that is different than mine. But in the end, we tell pretty much the same story in terms of what happened in these massacres and what an important component of the Holocaust by bullets was.
Yes, yes. So we are running out of time, but an important question came in about lessons now that we can learn from your research about group conformity and, group behavior, social psychology around the killings and the perpetrators. So what are lessons we can learn now?
Well, for one, I'm very grateful that the book has been used at all the military academies. And so the military is conscious of this. They are more now intentional in their training of officers, that officers have to be conscious of this and to think ahead of time in a sense of what you do in these circumstances when you get an unlawful order. And one of my PhD students at North Carolina, who was a West Point grad, was an officer, then came and went into academics, has also even written a kind of training manual that's used at West Point that is a kind of case study of a massacre in which the Army was asked by the SS to take part. And he goes through, in a sense, so you go through this in a sense as being aware you may have to make these choices, and you're not going to be blindsided when they come. For citizens more generally, of course, I think the importance is that one lesson we learn is that governments that want to commit genocide don't fail to do so for a shortage of executioners. That's not the bottleneck. And so the real key is how do you make sure that genocidal regimes don't come into power? How do you preserve democratic cultures? How do you preserve a culture based upon the value of human life and democratic values that doesn't adopt policies of genocide or mass killing? Because once you do that, you'll find people who will pull the trigger for you.
Thank you so much, Professor Browning. This was an amazing talk. I've learned so much. I've read the book and, like I said, was one of the first books I read on the Holocaust. And we use ordinary men in our police training at the museum. and as a case study. So it's an honor to have you here and to speak to all of us. So in conclusion, I would like to thank everybody for attending this evening's program. There will be a survey in the chat. If you could please fill that out for us. It helps us providing feedback to funders, make sure we're on the mark. We are thrilled to be hosting our new special exhibition, Mandela Struggle for Freedom, and we will be hosting our opening program on Thursday, February 18th at 7 p.m. So please check our website, our events website for more details. The museum is also open now from Wednesdays to Sundays with all our safety protocols in place. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.